name is Christine Brin. I am here from the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. I have been there for probably about 15 years or so it's a lot of fun, and I got to admit, this is my first Revolutionary War topic, and I'm excited to share it with everybody. Before I get too started, though, I do want to point out this is part of the Maritime Museum's Maritime Heritage Lecture Series. While our museum is closed, we've been very thankful and appreciative that Fort Macon's been willing to host us for this lecture series so we can keep it going. We're going to be taking a little bit of a hiatus on our lectures for about another month. Our next lecture will be on August 21st, by hook or by crook, the story of the pirates Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Not many people realize there were female pirates out there. Totally different end of the history spectrum there. But today we're here to talk about the Battle of Beaufort, part of the American Revolution. Now, if you've not ever heard of the Battle of Beaufort, don't worry, most haven't. There is a general debate going on right now at the Maritime Museum between myself and my fellow historian, the maritime historian, because I call it the Battle of Beaufort. Most people call it the Battle of Beaufort. He argues it's the Raid of Beaufort and that it doesn't rate the level of battle. The definition of battle is actually that it is a hostile encounter between opposing military forces, as opposed to a raid, which is just a hostile, predatory event. So after this program, I present to you the challenge of, do you think it's a battle or do you think it's a raid? I obviously strongly argue Battle of Beaufort. It's also one of our prize events during the American Revolution. So we're going to jump into it. Let's see. Technology, love it when it works. Okay, so obviously, the American Revolutionary War had been going on for quite a while. The Battle of Beaufort itself will actually occur towards the end of the American Revolution. It's considered one of the last battles, if you call it a battle. I know, I'm putting that caveat out there. But it is considered one of the last battles of the American Revolution. It happens after the surrender of Yorktown in Virginia, which happened on October 19th, 1781. When news of this very key surrender and key decisive event had happened, many people up and down the coast or throughout the colonies very much took a big sigh of relief. In their minds, the war was over. It had been decided. This was a decisive defeat. But it was not actually the end of the war. Here in Carteret County, we see our militia really start to not officially disband, but start going back to their everyday jobs. We start seeing they start seeing a lot of the militia kind of disbanding, not officially. They don't disband until officially the end of the war. I believe it's in September. But we start seeing that kind of, like I said, the relaxing here in Carteret County that is indicative up and down the coast. In that meantime, a lot of the military officials are still arguing, please don't relax. The war is not over. The British are still here. For example, in Charleston, the British were still very much, the Charleston people were still very much under siege. Also New York. It wouldn't be till December of 1782 that we would see the official evacuation and return of control of Charleston back to out of British control. So there was still a lot of British activity. There was still a lot of threat to our coast, potential threat. And one of the arguments was that we have all of these ships of British military that had come here, obviously, for the American Revolutionary War, and they were going to need to restock and get supplies before heading back across the ocean. And all of these colonies and towns along the coast, such as Beaufort, would be very ideal targets. We didn't listen. We were like, we're good. The war is over. It's fine. And that spring of 1782, we see spring come early according to the books. And spring of 1782, we start seeing all of our Carteret County residents. They're planting their fields as they normally would. They're laying new keels for vessels. They're starting to fish. The thoughts of war are very far from their minds. The only people that are still really considering worried about the war are the ones that still have soldiers that have not yet returned from larger encampments. But otherwise, we're seeing life returning to relatively normal. A new normal, I should say. And That would continue on until April 3rd, 1782, and this is when the Battle of Beaufort technically kicks off. In an interesting way, in only Carteret County could it happen this way, if you're familiar with it. So April 3rd, 1782, here we have, just to orient you, Cape Lookout. And then this is the point here, so Cape Lookout Bay. We have a group of whalers out on Shackleford, and they're hanging out near what they call the ruins of Fort Hancock, watching for whales. What the whalers in this area would do is we did have a whaling industry in Carteret County. They were not a whaling industry like you'd associate with the Northeast, which is a little bit better known. We did a lot of shore-based whalings, which means these men would sit around on the beach waiting to see the whales. So what these men were doing is they were sitting around by that Fort Hancock waiting to see the whales. What they noticed on April 3rd is a ship and 2 schooners. I think they saw a ship and 2 schooners enter the harbor, drop anchor. The ship sends a boat out to the shore to come onto the beach. The whalers actually help the boat up onto it, help the men up. These men get off of the boat and introduce themselves as New Englanders. They go, oh, we're definitely not British. Definitely British, for the record. They had come out of Charleston, and they were coming here to raid for supplies. But they get out of their boat and they go, we're definitely not British. We're from New England. That's why we sound a little different. And the whalers totally accept it. And they're like, but your ships are British. We can see that. And they go, those are our prizes. We stole those from the British. And what they do, so they said, we want to go into Beaufort. And they're like, oh, that's cool, but it's low tide and it's going to be dark. You don't want to do that at night, and you got to wait till high tide. And so the British or the definitely not British sailors are like, okay, well, we'll wait. And so in the meantime, the whalers take the British sailors down to Davis' house just down the way, and they drink all night together, repeatedly toasting to their prizes, to the wonderful ships that they stole from the British. The next morning, they pilot the cruise into what is known as Old Topsail Inlet, today Beaufort Inlet. And they go, so next day at high tide, the townfolk of Beaufort actually note in a lot of their journals that they watch these ships come in. Obviously, this is pretty noteworthy. There's not a lot of action going on. You don't get a lot of strangers in the area. So they're all really curious about these ships that are sitting in Old Topsail Inlet. Traditionally, when a ship would come in, they would send out a boat to come in and say like, hey, this is who we are. This is why we're here. And there's nothing. Nobody's coming off of this boat. So the locals start going out in their boats. They're like, we want to see what's going on. So they take their boats out there. And a lot of locals are going out and they're not coming back. They're being taken prisoner. We know this now. They don't know it. So what I think, it's kind of humorous, the thought that like they see this one person go out and not come back. So the next guy's like, well, I'm going to go too. And then they all go. So it looks like quite a handful of people went out before they, unfortunately, not returning and largely being taken hostage. And this will be playing a key role later in the battle. Now, what we see happening on shore is we have a Major Dennis and his companion, Captain Diedrich Gibble. They are actually of the Carteret County Militia, or Regiment Militia, and that, as I said, had largely disbanded a little earlier there to go and do their normal duties or normal jobs. This may not be the house they actually stood on. This is just an example. But according to their documentary, or documents, they were standing on one of the second floor porches of one of the houses on the waterfront of Beaufort, watching this happen, watching people go out and not come back, go out and not come back. Gibble decided he was a little suspicious about this, rightly so, and suspected that they were probably dealing with a British ship, and that is what was happening. So what Gibble decided to do was to go out under what is called a flag of truce. Now, fun fact for you, this is actually a towel that was used as a flag of truce by Confederate troops during General Robert E. Lee's surrender. So not the one used here, but still a fun one to take a look at. A towel, yes. Traditionally, a flag of truce is that white flag. It comes with a number of military rules, meaning I'm coming to you in peace. You're not supposed to do any kind of violence towards the person that is arriving under that flag of truce. Rules of war. Unfortunately, the British did not consider this an official battle, so they did not feel like they had to follow these rules of war. Gibble sails out or rows out to the ship with his flag, wanting to find out what's going on. Gibble also gets taken hostage. So Gibble is now out of the picture. At this point, it is getting dark in Beaufort. If any of you have ever been out on the waterfront when when electricity is down or something, it gets dark fast and it gets very dark. So they saw the dark was coming. Gibble did not return. Major Dennis hurried to actually one Easton's plantation, which was right here near down on the Beaufort area, and reported the circumstances to Colonel Easton, who quickly dispatched riders throughout the county for help to warn the people. Now, when I talk about crowds of people, later on, they were actually say he got together a whole group of men, and then it would be like a couple documents later, they'll go, there was 8 of them. So the numbers we are talking are not in the 50s or hundreds. We're talking like 8 guys on horses. And that was pretty exciting. It was a very sparsely populated area. So 8 guys on horses is still a very good representation. So Easton quickly dispatched those riders throughout the county for help to warn the people. He also not only wanted to gather men and supplies to help defend, but also to warn the different houses like, hey, if you see somebody that says they're from New England, maybe don't listen to them. Maybe lock your door. He gathered what men he could. He armed them with guns that he had actually kept when the militia disbanded. So what I find interesting is these men arrived and he handed them guns that they had never used before, largely. And this is going to come in key later because they're going to have multiple shootouts where nobody gets hurt. And they're going to go, oh, we were doing a lot of shooting. And they're going to be like, oh, I got a wound in my thigh. And you're like, but you just made it sound like this epic shootout battle and nobody gets hurt. So, so they're out there, they're out warning the county. We are still on April 4th. It is now dark. See, my dark. It's now dark. Easton and his 8 men are patrolling the shorelines. Now, for better or worse, they probably had lanterns in their hands, very much marking their location. So the British are like, not going to go there. But they're patrolling the shorelines, trying to keep everything safe. While they're patrolling the shorelines on Taylor's Creek, as we know it today, they start hearing the oars in the water. And they know that the British are out there with a landing crew trying to come onto the land. They ultimately follow the sound of the oars, and what they find is one of the ship boats have come up onto the shore, and one of the sentries has stopped them. And once again, the men on the boat are like, we're friends. We were just out there on Shackleford drinking with the whalers. It's fine. Just let us on. And fortunately, the commander saw this and was like, no. Specifically Easton sensed the deception, realized that that these were the British, called his sentry back to him, and then they immediately started firing on each other. The British would retire about a half-mile eastward, and they would run off, not wanting to get shot at, as inefficient as the shooting was. And they would land on what was Carrot Island at the time. Now, keep in mind, the Rachel Carson Reserve, as we know it today, did not look the same then as it does today. It was largely all marsh, with really only one end having even a few bushes on it. So it's not the island we see today. It's not a solid thing. It's really not attractive as a place if you're the British and you're looking for cover. So according to the documentation, they landed on Carrot Island and they crawled undiscovered through the handful of bushes that were actually growing out there. Now, this is marshland, so I want you to imagine April, these guys are crawling around in a marsh around these bushes, trying to sneak back up on the waterfront of Beaufort while our 8 guys are just standing on shore going, we know where you are. So what these guys, the British decide they're going to do is they're going to ford Taylor's Creek. So they decide they're going to get into the water and kind of swim across and try and sneak up on the waterfront. The average water temperature in Beaufort, in Taylor's Creek in April is about 60 degrees. So it's not August. It's not that nice water we like when we, or I don't know, in August it feels like bath water, but it's still a little chilly. It's the middle of the night. Fortunately, it's April, so probably not too many mosquitoes, but they're trying to get through. Obviously, I tried to get, nobody took a picture of them in the water. They take their time trying to get across. They're not as efficient about it as you would think. And at first light the next morning, a sentry immediately spots them in the water and runs back, and they do have another firefight again as the British start to come back up onto the waterfront, shooting at each other. This is the time where we see one of the few actual times where somebody gets injured. We see a British Major Stewart. He gets wounded in the hand, which if you've ever shot off a black powder rifle, he probably did it to himself. And then we also see a private who gets wounded so severely that he does end up dying. But before he dies, he makes the very interesting request that when he is buried, he be buried standing up in salute to his king. Some of you may be familiar with his grave, which is at the old burying ground in Beaufort. And then one of Easton's men on the Beaufort side would receive a light wound on his thigh. So like I said, 2 very dramatic exchanges of fire, and they're like, I hurt my thigh. That's all Beaufort walks away with. So the British aren't doing too much better with their target practice, and those are their guns. Beaufort at least could say, hey, I haven't really worked with that gun much. So Easton and his men would recognize that as the British were coming on shore, that they were greatly outnumbered by the British, and even though they would return fire, they would make their way down to Captain Biddle's house, and this is where they would ultimately, obviously this is not Biddle's house, Gibble's house will come in a minute, Biddle's house, and they would make a kind of makeshift battery there. They would get there about 4:30, and then other men would start to kind of join them at that house with more weapons. Ultimately, a report would come in that 2 men arrived and reported that the enemy was actually assembling behind Captain Gibble's house, which you see here. Captain Gibble's house is actually still standing. It is on Marsh Street in Beaufort, about 3 blocks east of Craven. If you ever want to wave at it, don't go and knock on the door. It's privately owned. They will not like that. But it is there, so you can always see it. So the enemy was assembling behind the Gibble house, and at this time they could see there more coming along the beach, and they were really feeling helpless as they watched the enemy just come up the beach and take over Beaufort and start raiding a lot of the houses. They see one group of, they call him Captain Singletree. He starts coming along the beach. They're trying to signal to this guy saying, don't go near, the British are over there. He does not notice them and gets taken hostage. So now the British have many hostages to hold over our heads, or hold over the Beaufort militia's heads. Like I said, really the picture you're supposed to be taking away now is the men of the area are overpowered. The British are really showing up in a lot of numbers. They're really starting to take over the place, and it's unfortunate. Boom. Nobody took a picture of them, so I'm fortunate that somebody did illustrate to some level the raiding that was going on. They were completely overpowered by the numbers. They did escape out of Beaufort, out of the immediate Beaufort area. On the way out of Beaufort, as they were heading to kind of reconvene, they spotted 2 guys that were in the middle of actually plundering, and they took them hostage. So, yay for the Beaufort militia. They have their first 2 hostages, which will play a very key role later when they're trying to get their hostages back. Because initially, when I said that the British were not recognizing this as an official battle. They would try to say that our men, or I'm not a Beaufortite, so I shouldn't be able to say that. The Beaufort militiamen were deserters, not prisoners of war, so they weren't due those rules that would surround them. But once the Beaufort militia had two of their guys, they're like, it's a battle, prisoner of war, we're recognizing all the rules now. So it changes the dynamic to some level once we have our own captured men here. So we are now, we're continuing on. It is still April 5th. I don't know why I didn't write the date there for you to help you keep up with it, but it is still April 5th. It is now 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There is a new Colonel Ward of the Carteret County Militia. He has now arrived with an additional 20 men to help beef up the defense of Beaufort. Yay, more than 8. They decided to make their post at the town bridge, knowing that this group of men were there helping to defend the area. A lot of the locals started to show up at the town bridge, bringing with them reports that were just heartbreaking of what was going on in Beaufort, what the British were doing. They had women and children and old folks arriving. They told of the British entering their homes, taking furniture, anything they could carry, smashing things that were too large for them. One of them, which I thought was a very interesting illustration, is they talk about how they would actually slit open the mattresses and then openly throw the feathers all over the streets. So they say you would walk through the streets and the feathers are just flying all over the place. Really, Hollywood needs to get a hold of this because it's quite a scene. It's an illustrative scene. They're slitting the things. They're strewing feathers all over. They're in the streets. They were grabbing women and actually tearing their clothes open so they could get to their petticoat pockets and check out what was in there. So it really had become quite chaotic and not fun anymore. And they were all very distressed, and they're coming here to the town bridge asking for help. They're like, come on, can you do something about this? So we're moving on to April 6th. They started to compile these reports. We now have significantly more than 8 men, which is great. We've got quite a collection. I think at this point we have about 28 men. By morning, Easton had gathered at least those 8 horsemen again, and they were kept constantly patrolling and watching the enemies. Messengers were sent and orders, so they actually ended up sending messages out to Bogue Banks, where we are today, and White Oak companies to remain on the west side of the Newport River under Major West. Their concern was that the British would finish in Beaufort and then they would move on to areas like Harker's Island or out here towards Bogue's Banks, looking for more supplies, specifically fresh water. So they would send a guard of 13 men specifically out to Harker's Island, both to observe the enemy's action and to guard their storehouses. Following this, we would see a flurry of messages. I was like, a lot of little notes going back and forth. There would be a Mrs. Thompson that would arrive at the camp here in Beaufort at the town bridge from the commander of the British fleet that we know is named D. McLean. And he would state that he goes, oh, we were never going to destroy your town. Don't be aggressive towards us. We just want to steal your stuff. And they're like, oh, that's fair, I guess. He's like, as long as you guys stay peaceful, we won't destroy your town. But on that note, we want our guys back. So he wants to set up an exchange of prisoners. And our guy, and on our side, Colonel Easton replied in a message that he was willing to have a conference or exchange of prisoners because he knew that they had significantly more people than we had as far as prisoners go. And they end up sending back and forth quite a flurry of notes. And the British replied, your flag will be received at 12 o'clock tomorrow. So they finally set up an appointment to meet at noon on April 7th, 1782, to do a bit of a exchange of prisoners. Easton replied that he thinks it's necessary to actually return before that Mr. Gibble, because Mr. Gibble was the gentleman that had sailed out at the very beginning of all of this action under the flag of truce. So he had been taken hostage illegally against all the rules of battle. And he said, so I really think you should be giving me back Mr. Gibble at this point. He is not technically a hostage. And he actually said, and Easton says in his notes, I'll send 2 officers over to the schoolhouse at 1 o'clock. and you can go ahead and release Mr. Gibble to us. And the British said no. They said, we're not releasing anybody. Major Stewart did agree to meet, but the British were unwilling to release Mr. Gibble, and also demanded that the two of the town's prisoners, remember those two guys I said they got earlier, be released to the English. And they were like, why are we going to give you back your two guys if you're not even willing to give us this one guy? Easton would not agree to this, and negotiations would largely fail because it was obviously not very fair to the Beaufortites. Hostilities would commence immediately. The Beaufortites, the Beaufort militia, now had their cannons set up in makeshift little fort, or had some cannons, mostly 3-pounders, so nothing too large. They're still good sized, and they would start shooting. I'm sorry, one cannon shot. They successfully got one cannon shot out towards the enemy, which fell into their camp, and the militia from the other parts of the county began to arrive. So we're seeing more and more men showing up here in Beaufort and really helping to get us prepared to take the town back. They arrived to support the Beaufort men and report that the enemy were busy moving plunder to the ships. So the ones that are coming up from Beaufort or coming to the area are saying, we're seeing them really moving all your stuff out of the way. And there was a little concern. Word was also received that the enemy had attempted to land in Harker's Island, but if you remember, they put those 13 guys out there and they had no luck. They got repulsed immediately. So there was no luck there, but they did try to get on land. Captain Foote was commanding 12 men in two boats, went out into the harbor to intercept the enemy's boats carrying the plunder. He had hoped that if he went out there, he could, as just 3 guys, be like, 13 guys, stop them from taking all the stuff from Beaufort. The enemy would shoot a 6-pound cannonball at the camp, which would largely stop their defense of going after them. A short time later, the British would actually set fire to the schoolhouse where they were supposed to meet, and then they would retire as night would fall. Now, what's really interesting is when we hear the plunder being listed, there's a couple of people that they talk about money, they talk about furniture, and then there's one gentleman who was talking about the fact, Josiah Martin, that his books and all his deeds and his paperwork and his journals were stolen from his house. It's like, why would the British take deeds and all of this? It means nothing to him. And I was actually able to find later on, there was a petition by Josiah Martin made to the governor of North Carolina that's in our archives, where he stated that he calls them privateers, but the British that had attacked Beaufort were holding his paperwork ransom because what they wanted was the paperwork that belonged to the last royal governor of North Carolina, who had to evacuate North Carolina under duress obviously early under the war, and had left behind a lot of his paperwork. So what their argument was, we'll give you back all your deeds and all your paperwork if you give us Governor Martin's paperwork. So he goes to the state government, to the governor of North Carolina, and says, hey, this stuff is really important to me personally. And North Carolina's governor goes, yeah, but that's not our problem. We can't give you what would be very secret information. So he never ends up getting his papers back, and they never end up giving Martin's papers back. But it resolved the mystery of why the British were stealing this poor guy's journals. So we're back at the conflict itself, at the battle. It's now April 8th, 1782. During the day, we see a number of messages being passed back and forth between the commanders of the two sides. Mr. Gibble stating that Easton's stand on not releasing the British prisoners would be to the disadvantage of the town folk and all those held prisoner on the British ship, meaning I'm going to take revenge on all of them. Mr. Gibble, on the other hand, is sitting on land seeing his group of men growing as other groups are arriving. And he's like, I don't know. I don't think you've done a head count recently. We're getting the advantage. Ultimately, after a series of these messages going back and forth, there would be an agreement reached for a time and place for negotiations. But before the meeting, a party of men of the town surprised 2 boatloads of the British enemy that were plundering a home on the west side of North River and took an additional 3 prisoners, wounded 5 or 6 men, including the officer commanding the land party. So we're seeing the dynamic starting to switch as these men are, as our militia here is starting to grow. They're starting to take more prisoners, and they're really starting to push back, which is wonderful. At the appointed time, the leaders on both sides agreed to meet at what is now the ruins of the schoolhouse, because earlier it had been burned down, and agreed to an exchange of prisoners. There were 4 conditions that were laid out for this meeting. The first, that the 2 prisoners, the 2 original prisoners that we know are named Matthias Long and John Robertson of the British line, be delivered unharmed. The second was that the American prisoners would be delivered to as well, but they would be delivered in a way that would be kind of delayed. So they'd have to see their British, they would get their British prisoners back, the ships would, and then they would kind of release the American prisoners. Third, for the delivery, it would happen at the next day, so April 10th at 10 o'clock at the ruins of the schoolhouse. And the fourth and final makes a lot of sense. It is that no hostilities be committed until after our meeting. So you can't shoot at us just because we're coming out to exchange prisoners. So they agree to this, and then, did I go right? Yes. They agreed to this the next morning. It was actually discovered that the enemy had completely left the town earlier than expected, much earlier than the agreed upon 10 o'clock time. They did the exchange of prisoners, so the 2 British, the ones that they had been holding hostage, were returned, but the British did not fulfill their agreement. They returned many of their hostages, but they retained their pilots, some of the townsmen, and there were some enslaved people that had also been taken during the raid, and they had kept all of them. And imagine how the Beaufort militia, or the Beaufortites, felt about that. On taking back possession again of the town battery, now that the British were out, they discovered that the British, Easton and his men, found that 3 of the guns had actually been dismounted. 1 was completely broken, and the others were spiked and filled with shot. The men set to work cleaning them out, and 1 was ready that day for firing. I had to look this up when I first started studying military history, so I'll share this fun fact with you. When I say a gun is spiked, what that means is they have taken a piece of metal and plugged the hole where you would put your light the actual cannon. Normally, they would have a spike that they could put in there and break off so that it would be hard to get in there. Or if they didn't have that, they would use a bayonet, stab that in the touch hole, and then break it off. So make it a little harder to fire off and delay any kind of retribution from our militia here. So like I said, they were able to get at least 1 of those guns ready for firing right there on April 10th. This is not them. This is just a group of, bless you. At midnight, Captain Niels and Maston of Craven County joined the camp. So we have more men showing up now with another 40 men. When they arrived, they were immediately informed that you're too late. All the fun's already happened. It's over. The guys have left. Early the following morning, April 11th, we see the ships are still out there. As soon as the other gun was cleared, the townspeople began to fire on the sloops that were trying to get out of the old topsail inlet. Immediately, the enemy also began to fire on the town. No one was killed or wounded. Once again, very poor marksmanship. We do have documentation of at least 2 houses where a cannonball went straight through it, though. Nobody was hurt, though. Easton ordered the captains Fulford and Foote to go to Shackleford Banks because he knew that what these men needed, these ships needed the most, was fresh water. And he knew they hadn't gotten it in Beaufort. How he knew this, I don't know. But he knew they hadn't gotten it in Beaufort. So he sent these men out to Shackleford to stop them from getting any fresh water. Oops, come on. About 9 o'clock that night, we don't know why. I haven't found any documentation why. The British set fire to one of their own sloops and destroy actually a quantity of provisions in naval stores. There is a story there. There's got to be, and I haven't been able to find it yet. Why did their ship go up in flames? But they took note of it. And then the following day, on April 12th, the people of the town were watching this fleet. They were just sitting there in the water. And then suddenly they document here in Beaufort that they could hear gunfire at Shackleford Banks. And later they see a ship and a schooner join the fleet, the British fleet. And word was received that the British that the men that had been put out there on Shackleford had actually had a landing party from the British try to come up on land to get their water. And they had successfully repelled them, prevented them from actually getting any water. And one of the things they made a note of is they go, we kept them from getting any water and we destroyed their water jugs. So they can't even get more if they want to. I was like, good for you. And very efficient. The next morning, so now we're on April 13th, the locals the next morning, the enemy has withdrawn. They're moving closer to the harbor. They've actually dropped anchor. And a group of townsmen are like, well, let's go check out this sloop that burned down, see if there's anything worth saving from it that we can steal from it. And lo and behold, they find a 3-pound cannon on that ship that they are able to retrieve, bring back to land, and clean up, and they use it to fire on the British. So I love that the British unintentionally also supplied them with needed supplies. Sunday morning, we've now moved on to April 14th. These poor British are still stuck in Old Topsail Inlet. They can no longer get onto land because now our militia has really started to beef up. All they want now is just fresh water, and they can't get it. Sunday morning, Easton and his men spend the day preparing shop for because they didn't know what was going to come, so they're building up their supply. And then someone noticed that there was a sloop approaching the bar. They try signaling to this sloop because it is an American sloop. It is not British. No matter what they can do, unfortunately, that sloop continues to come close, and it is captured by the British. The people of the Beaufort militia or the Carteret County militia note that they were quite disappointed in the sloop because it didn't even try to run away. They said it saw the British, noticed it was there, and then immediately struck its colors and surrendered to the British. And they were like, but you could have gotten away. Why didn't you fight? And we'll never know, I guess. Like I said, water was the thing that the British were wanting here. The next morning, so now we're on April 15th, the next morning, the lookout reported that the British were landing men on what was then Borden's Banks for the purpose of seeking water. They were intelligent this time, and they brought actual troops with them, more troops from the different ships to try and protect them as they got that water. Easton here with the militia quickly dispatched men from the camp in Beaufort to watch and keep them from getting the much needed water. When the enemy saw the men coming, they ran away and never got any water. Yay! Success. Obviously, I'm a little biased in who I want to win this battle. So this is my favorite part because this is, like I told you, Battle of Beaufort starts in only way a Carteret County Beaufort battle could start. And here, April 15th, 1782, the Beaufort militia is like, this whole group of ships is sitting here in Old Topsail Inlet. They're not doing anything except trying to get fresh water. We want them gone. So they come up with this idea. They start building up rafts, and they fill it with tinder and pine knots and straw and tar. And at dark, when they know the tide is going in the right direction and the wind with it, they set the rafts on fire and push them out into the water so that they sail towards the British fleet. Unfortunately, as these burning rafts sail towards the British fleet, the wind changes and pushes the rafts up on the beach. So they're like, we almost had it. But later, the pilots that were being held hostage on the British ships come back and they say, no, that wasn't a failure. You really scared them. They were like, which is no surprise, because I think it's on Thursday, April 16th, they notice after this, the British are starting to make moves to prepare to sail. But they have a bad wind that does not allow them to sail. So the crew stays there very peacefully. Beaufort people aren't shooting at them. They're not shooting at them. They're not sending out any more burning rafts at them right now. They're like, we'll give you until the wind settles, and then you need to leave. And then the following day, on April 17th, they at last leave. Sit down. They weighed anchor and headed for the bar. The men at the town battery exchanged the 5 shots, kind of shot at them 5 times as they left the inlet, which I thought was kind of like a parting blow, like, don't come back or else. At midday, they were over the bar where they paused to release the pilots and the rest of the other prisoners. The only prisoners they kept were those of the enslaved prisoners, and we're not sure what happened to those people after they left this area. The mission was officially over. By the end of this battle, the British vessels would officially number as 2 ships, 3 schooners, a sloop, and a small boat, which is presumed to be one of the boats they stole from one of the hostages here in Beaufort. But they left and they set course for Charleston. The prisoners were picked up. They were officially returned to town. Interestingly, the pilots brought with them a message from the commander of the British fleet, D. McLean, and it was a letter written specifically to Colonel Easton that stated that the townsmen, they would burn down the town to ashes if they dared harm any hair on the heads of the pilots, because the British were concerned that these pilots would be considered deserters and traitors to the cause because they had helped the British get out of the bar. And they said they were forced to do what they had done. They were forced to guide the vessels over the bar. Easton was like, that's not a problem. I don't blame these guys. And there was no retribution against the pilots. So success, April 13th to 17th, 1782 is the official battle there, dates of our Battle of Beaufort. The enemy were gone, the siege was over, and the men of the county had done their best. They kept the enemy, they may not have quite kept the enemy from pillaging the town, but they had kept it from spreading throughout the county. And they had kept them from destroying our local granary, the salt works, and the supplies in the warehouses on areas such as Harker's Island. We also see all of the plantations surviving with the exception of Borden's, who was the one who lost his journals and his deeds and such. And then we also, they kept them from supplying their ships with water. And they would ultimately, we would find out later that because they had such a poor experience here in Beaufort, they chose not to move on to Ocracoke and other ports that they had planned on harassing or raiding as well. Help did arrive when it was too late. We do see, like I said, all of these other men coming together. The governor, it turns out, had been, the North Carolina governor, had been warned of the expedition against Beaufort. And there was a lot of kind of unhappiness here in Beaufort when they discovered that the governor had actually known. He had received a message in early April that had warned that a force of 4 vessels was mounting a hull of 40 guns and manned with 250 seamen that were preparing in Charleston, specifically and very openly stating they were going to Beaufort to raid Beaufort. And that they were then, if they were successful here in Beaufort, would move on to Ocracoke. So here's our wonderful governor. He receives this message. He knows Beaufort is about to be attacked, and he actually does nothing. At one point, he says, I don't understand why they're attacking Beaufort. There's nothing there for them. Instead, he makes the choice to send reinforcements to New Bern and Edenton because he feels like they're a much richer prize. So he decides to defend them and leave Beaufort to its own devices because he genuinely doesn't think the British are going to arrive or stop in Beaufort. In all the communications that go on about this potential attack and raid by this British ship, he not once mentions moving any defense to Beaufort. So Beaufort was very much left to its own devices in defending themselves against this battle. I mentioned that the enslaved prisoners were never released by the British. The only documentation I was able to find for them was later on May 7th, 1782. Borden would apply for a flag, another flag of truce, with the hope of going to Charleston to hopefully retrieve these enslaved prisoners. There is no documentation of whether or not he actually got that flag awarded to him, or if he even was able to make it to Charleston, which was still occupied at that time by the British, but he did make that attempt. We know he never successfully got his paperwork back, though, so I don't know how he proved any of his banking needs at that point. But Borden was probably the loser out of this whole situation, and I do feel for him. But that is the Battle of Beaufort. I hope I've made a great argument for it being a battle. There was gunfire on both sides. There were prisoners of war on both sides. There was drinking at the very beginning. When you read some of the documentation, there's a lot of, and then they went and sat around the fire and drank. And then, so there was a lot of that. But I argue that this very much fits the description of a battle as opposed to just a raid, because they were successfully. I see someone trying to take a picture of the reference. I don't want to. I welcome any questions, any comments you might have. I do want to once again mention the fact that August 21st is going to be our next lecture in the lecture series. I hope you're able to join us here. All of our lectures are recorded. They were live. This one was live streamed through Zoom. They can't see us, but they can hear us. That's about it. And so if there's anything in this presentation that you want to re-review, it will be posted on the museum's YouTube page in about a week or two. So thank you very much. Oh, I'll come over to you. Good.
We know that the peacock was third major.
Yes, they're peacock was.
We know the
I haven't seen any documentation saying the names of them. No, yeah, peacock. You would think that, and we know the ones that
privateer.
They McLean wasn't technically a privateer. He didn't have that letter of marque at that point, but yeah, they were. He was Royal Navy. Yeah. But yeah, I only saw Peacock. I know there's some people they know who Peacock, the ships that tended to sail with it, but we don't know if that was who was here.
Yeah.
So yeah, Peacock's
amazing. They're so cool.
It's amazing how little, but also how much for this very 2-week period. Yeah. There's so many interesting details where they're like, oh, this person. Some of it is so minute detail.
Yeah.
But then the big things are lost.
Yeah. That's where was the bridge?
I don't know. I was hoping maybe
choice.
There's plenty of choices. I dug around. I have suspicions, but I don't know. I keep trying to figure out which one, because when they gave me, that was my thought, was that it's